John Hook's Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Saturday. Paul Penzone, first elected in 2016. Upsetting, I guess. Some people predicted it. The longtime sheriff, 24-year sheriff of Maricopa County, Joe Arpaio. He beat him in the general election, 56% to 44%. Beat him by 665,000 votes. Is that correct?
No, I think that's...
No, that was your vote total.
Yeah, it was about 250,000 votes, something like that was the spread. So yeah, if you're going to win, yeah, you want to make sure it's a strong win. And the community was good to me, so it was decisive.
Good to see you, Sheriff.
Thank you.
Good to see you. You are running again. There's no question about it.
No question about it.
Okay, and you still love it.
Absolutely. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity to not only focus on what's most important, public safety, but to help promote a community that is thriving, that has so much to offer, and to make it about the people in the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, which for too long it hasn't been about them.
Are you surprised when you heard about this billboard that went up that said, Sheriff Joe, one more time, 2020? We never got a picture of it. I'd show it to you, but we never got it was down before we could capture a shot of it. When that popped up, what did you think? Did you think it was a trial balloon? What did you think?
No, I honestly didn't put a whole lot of thought into it because one of the things that was definitely defining of my predecessor was trying to be larger than life, and his support base and others who are very passionate about him still try to bring that to relevance. But I don't get caught up in that because I've made a commitment and I've stuck to it, which is focus on the job of public safety and don't worry about politics. If I do my job well and people have an appreciation for what I'm doing, then I'll be the sheriff for the next term, and that's what I'm focused on.
Do you think he might run? Do you think it's possible?
I mean, we live in a unique political climate, so anything is possible. But again, if I'm devoting energy in that space, then I'm not paying attention to the needs of the office.
But it is a political position. I mean, you've got to run for re-election.
Sure. And the key is just to do your job so well and be the big dog in the park that people just want to keep you there to protect them, and then you don't worry about anybody else.
I mean, it is an elected position. I'm always curious, you are naturally a lawman. That was your whole pedigree. You were hired by the Phoenix Police Department in 1988. You spent 21 years there. 7 years you ran Silent Witness. You're basically a cop.
Yeah, and
you're
the part
not
that's
a
overlooked.
Politician. You are now,
sure,
but that's not really your pedigree.
No,
right?
and the part that's, Silent Witness was high profile, so that's where I garnered a lot more public recognition, but I spent a lot of my work in narcotics. I worked on a federal task force, so being an investigator first was, my DNA, and then it evolved into trying to help solve crimes through that experience. But I do this job because it should be led by a professional law enforcement person who is committed to ethics and integrity and public safety first. And
so is a political thing an uncomfortable fit for you?
No, it's the cost of doing business, but you can't prioritize the politics over the policing. You address the politics and make sure that it doesn't interfere, because if it impedes my world, it affects the employees who work for me, and my job is to be the gatekeeper.
Okay, let's talk about, and I know you've been out there talking about this in the past couple of weeks, the mass shootings. Dayton, El Paso. You've had a take on this, that society needs to take a really hard, cold look at what's going on. Now, when you say that, are we talking about more gun regulation, or are we talking about trying to get at the root of why people, young men generally, are doing this?
I think if you look at any problem, you look at it in its capacity. What are all the contributors? And not only are all the contributors that lead to these horrific incidents, but what are pieces of the process that also have to be addressed that can potentially mitigate it. So in my opinion, nothing should be off the table when you have a thoughtful conversation. And then as we come together as a nation and as people who are responsible for leadership, we make hard decisions to say, how do we put our children first and our families first? And how do we make sure that whatever laws we implement, they're thoughtful and they're effective?
Are you a supporter of the Second Amendment?
Absolutely.
Okay, now as a lawman, when you were out there on the streets, you were probably toward the end of your career running into criminals sometimes who could outgun you guys. How did that make you feel about the Second Amendment, being on the other end of it, where criminals might have in their possession weapons that could do you real harm?
Sure, and let me put it in context. Having grown up on the East Coast in a state of New Jersey where guns were not prevalent, it wasn't until I became an officer that I actually had my first exposure to guns and trained with one. Think about the LA shooting when they had the bank robberies, when LAPD faced those who were heavily armed, and it changed law enforcement completely on the ground.
And I think the suspects in that had body armor on.
They had body armor, and they had, they had weaponry that by far
That was
outmatched.
a wake-up call nationally for law enforcement. Was
We
it
changed
not?
our practice. I remember Phoenix PD having to go out and find money to acquire rifles so that we could meet it head-to-head. The pendulum has swung too far, in my opinion. It swung too far that the volume of weaponry that is available and the ability of that weaponry to do mass destruction has actually grown so much that it has put a greater emphasis on our focus to keep people safe. It has put a greater challenge on law enforcement to keep our community safe.
We've got 370 million guns in this country and a population of 320 million people.
I'm just a firm believer that the Second Amendment, reasonable gun laws or gun ownership laws, and safety for our children can all coexist in a space if we just want to have the conversation to consider what could be done to
Do
make
you
a safer
think there
community.
needs to be restrictions on assault? So, quote unquote, whatever it means, an assault rifle.
Yes.
A restriction on that.
Case in point, the shooting in Las Vegas with the bump stocks. An improvised piece of equipment for the most part that was attached to make a weapon fully auto.
And they did, at least Congress did address that.
Sure, they did. But how long did it take to address it? And why did it take so long? And knowing that
I think no one had heard about a bump stock until that shooting.
No, I don't disagree with you. But if we require, in order to have a fully automatic weapon, you have to get a tax stamp and go through a process to do that. If we know we're willing to put a limitation in that space, if there are other weapons that should be given consideration or tools, why do we fear talking about it and making a determination? And bump stocks really weren't addressed until the public pressure required it be addressed.
Let's run through. I want to do this because it's an important exercise. Parkland, Florida, February 14th, 2018. Nicholas Cruz, law enforcement failed to heed the warnings of his concerning behavior. He had made threats, was expelled from school, bragged about killing animals, posed with guns on social media, but he bought an AR-15 style rifle legally and brought it to the high school and killed 17 people.
Sure.
Existing gun law did not stop this guy. He would have he was cleared. He bought a weapon.
Sure. No, and there are many cases where guns are acquired lawfully, so the law in of itself is not the solution. Laws are usually implemented to try to address a problem because there's a societal issue, but the law itself will not correct or rectify the challenge. But let's back up on that statement for a second. I think early on it said law enforcement failed to
heed warnings of concerning behavior. Yeah. He had made threats, was expelled from school, bragged about killing animals, posed with guns on social media, went to a clinic for mental health treatment before getting an AR-15.
Sure. And here's where I think we have to have a greater focus. Oftentimes we believe law enforcement will be the solution, but we have an oath
I
of
don't,
office.
By the way.
Yeah, no, I know.
And I don't think Congress is necessarily
honestly.
the solution either.
Yeah, let's speak honestly about that. Our job is to be the guardians, the caretakers of the law itself. Mm-hmm. And not every situation is a law broken, and people have rights, and we talk about the Second Amendment where they can possess weapons. And unless they have crossed the threshold where a crime has been committed, we're limiting our actions. So how do we surround the problem with more resources? How do we get families to be more accountable to their loved ones who are faced with challenges? And I hear too often we defer to mental health, mental illness. It's not that it's not a factor, but it is not always the factor. Right. So how do we demand, insist as family members that our family members who are faced with whether it's anger, whether it's violence, whether it's whatever, drug addiction or mental health, to get them the help that they need and to be more proactive in managing the things that are going on in their lives.
My point is, we've got, depending on who you believe, there are dueling statistics about how many gun laws we have in this country. The high end, people say we have 3,000 gun laws. Mm-hmm. On the low end, it's 300. 300's a lot. The point is that even with all these laws, these things keep happening. We've got a lot of gun laws on the books. Let me run down a couple more. Patrick Kelly, Devin Patrick Kelly. This is Sutherland Springs, Texas. 25 killed. History of domestic abuse barred him from legally buying guns, but did so anyway because information about his crime was never entered into the database. Used for a background check. He gets a gun. Las Vegas, Paddock, you mentioned him. Nothing in Paddock's background would have raised a flag. This guy was wealthy, purchased an arsenal over a span of a year. Orlando, Florida, Omar Mateen purchases an AR-15 a Sig Sauer MCX
Yeah, I mean,
in a handgun.
the list goes on.
You
and
know
on.
the list, but I am amazed at how many, and I looked at it. 70% of these shooters buy their stuff legally.
Yeah.
It's not at a gun show. It's
So-
not at a gun show loophole. They're buying the stuff legally.
I agree. The accessibility is too prevalent. It is too
So
easy
what do
to
we do?
acquire a weapon. Well, let's talk about the different lanes of potential, because what are we trying to do? We're trying to mitigate something that we can't control.
Well, let me stop you there. Do you believe that politicians can actually pass a law that would stop this? I'm sorry,
No.
I don't.
No, but the problem goes deeper. So let me just back up for a second. I talked about to believe that we can live in a free society where violence will no longer exist is unrealistic.
I agree.
But how we can mitigate and reduce the volume of violence that we see in our society is within our control, and it comes into all different factors. Quite frankly, you and I should be focused on what can we implement now so that our children's children will live in a safer place.
What would that be?
Let me just back up because you asked a question about Congress and laws. I've expressed this publicly, and I'll say it again. All the laws that are written are normally written by whom?
Lawmakers.
Okay, and how much knowledge do most lawmakers truly have as it relates to public safety or what laws that
You make
funnily-
my point.
Yeah, so
I
if-
think we
if-
put too much. You're a politician now, but
easy. Why you got to attack me
I
like
know,
that
it's
in this
but
friendly setting?
You're in an
Let me
elected
finish my thought,
office.
though. Let me finish my thought,
But
though.
my point is, we put too much faith in these people to fix our lives for us,
We give
and
them
I'm just
too
not
much
sure they can do it.
power. We give them too much power to implement things that may not be their background, their education, their
Absolutely right.
expertise. So if it's going to be related to traffic safety, if it's going to be gun safety, it's going to relate public safety, law enforcement professionals should be at the table as part of the conversation before legislation is written. Attorneys who specialize in constitutional and other areas should be at the table. Maybe healthcare professionals should be at the table. So when the legislation is written, it's not written by a person who had no background but was elected to office to write, and all of a sudden it's a numbers game to get it passed. We're a society that is woven with each other to try to accomplish these things, so why not call on each other to get it done right? I would rather have 50 effective gun laws than 300 ineffective ones. But we empower and allow those to write on our behalf who have the least amount of experience to understand what the true problem is and what needs to be done to address it.
On the gun law part, do you think that there's any way, with all of these, we're awash in weapons in this country, that even if you pass laws, people who wish to do us harm will be able to find a gun?
No, they'll absolutely be able to find a gun, and that's why I stated earlier, our solution, we live in a immediate gratification time. You know, people, you pick up your phone, you look at the news, what's real time. You used to do 3 newscasts a day or 2, now you're probably doing 7. We should be focused on not what is immediate gratification, but what is long-term sustainable success. So let's make the commitment to make change so that our children and our children's children are in a position to have a healthier, well life because we've created that environment.
I think everybody would agree with that. I think what I'm looking for is there anything specifically that you have come up with where you say, we need to do this?
Yeah, and that's what, you know, I'm a sheriff now, so what am I going to do now to keep our community safe? We work hand in hand. We actually hosted the first School Safety Summit in Arizona in partnership with the Arizona Business and Education Coalition, the Arizona administrators. We invited legislators, social workers, psychologists, educators, law enforcement, and did I say legislators already? Forgive
You
me.
did. So what
Everybody
did you
to the
learn
table.
from that?
Well, we learned everyone's perspective on things that could contribute to the solution, and then we had takeaways where we said we will meet again to implement a school safety review. We will talk again about trying to find funding for a counselor. We will talk again to determine how we can work with legislators to write laws or get rid of ineffective laws and write ones that are more effective.
This was for schools.
We talked about red flags.
But even schools, statistically, schools are still on any given day one of the safest places you can be in America.
What is a true safe place in America right now? We don't know because the threats that we face are encroaching on the space that we thought was
A safe haven.
yeah, churches, schools.
Right. We've had them in all of
community
those.
Environments. So we know that our children go to school now with a level of concern, whether it is reality or whether it is
They're doing active
perception.
shooter drills.
Exactly. So how can we make sure that we start in the spaces where our most vulnerable are exposed and try to build from there to ensure that everyone in the community is invested in safety. This is my job,
Right.
but it's everybody's opportunity to be a part of it.
Paul Penzone, Maricopa County Sheriff. When we come back, legalizing marijuana, recreational marijuana, what you think about that. And use of deadly force, which is something that your office is dealing with as well as agencies all over the country. We spend a lot of time on guns, gun control, and mass shootings. We'll depart from that when we come back on Newsmaker Saturday. Back with Maricopa County Sheriff Paul Penzone, elected in 2016, as you know, defeated long-term sheriff, 24-year sheriff Joe Arpaio, and beat him pretty soundly in that election. I want to drop off here because you run the second largest jail system in the country. Jeffrey Epstein, you've got to explain to me how a guy like this on suicide watch, and you guys have him down at 4th Avenue, you have him at your jails, people on suicide watch. How does this guy kill himself? Or if an inmate really wants to do themselves harm, badly enough, they'll be able to do it.
Sure. Well, anytime something happens in our jail system, we have a responsibility for the care and control of those in our custody. But I will tell you, since becoming sheriff, the dynamic of what goes on in a correctional institution and the demand on our correctional officers, our detention officers, is far beyond what most people realize. It is probably the industry that has the most difficult time of recruitment and retention because of the environment they work in every day. And we're talking about a human element. So this is not an excuse for what happened, but we're talking about the human element.
Out this week that 2 of the people fell asleep on the job.
Sure.
I don't know if that's by design, a convenient excuse, or if they really did. I don't know.
Yeah. So it is the human element, and we cannot afford to fail. We cannot afford to be distracted from our mission. So, and I'll speak to our own jail system. We have about 8,300 inmates every given day of the year. We process anywhere between 200 and 300 in and out each day.
Wow.
We have over 100,000 that come through the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office jails annually. We're still short by about 12% staffing. That's the biggest part of our organization. Most people don't realize that, but we have about 2,300 detention officers to staff the 5 jails that we have. It is a grueling demand. They work a considerable amount of overtime because we're, again, trying to staff up while attrition has and continues to be a challenge. So there are times when the human element kicks in.
Does that compromise safety in those facilities?
It absolutely does.
Let me ask you on that front. We are grappling with this immigration issue. We are not a sanctuary city here in Phoenix, but the fact remains that figuring out somebody's status when they are arrested by agencies all over Maricopa County, when they come to your jail, that's the clearinghouse where you figure out who's here and why they're here and what their deal is, right?
Sure.
This is where we generally find out if somebody is in the country illegally, if they have been caught up in a crime.
Correct.
That's where it happens.
Absolutely. 100% of those booked into the Maricopa County jails will go through a point where an ICE agent will interview them to determine if they are lawfully in the nation.
So the cops aren't doing it on the street because they don't want to. It would interfere with police work.
I can't speak for other agencies, but for our agency, we're prohibited because of federal court orders. But every agency that books into our jail system will be turning over a detainee who will be interviewed by an ICE agent. And when that person is lawfully set for release by bond or by judge's order, if ICE chooses to hold on to them and to transfer them to a federal detention center, at the end of the jail system, we will turn them back over so they can transport them and hold them accountable. Okay. I'm committed. I just want to speak to this. I'm a firm believer that if you enter into another country, you're accused of committing a crime and you have entered unlawfully, there are consequences. So as it relates to that, we will hold firm to our practices, or to the practices of supporting another agency who's responsible for it.
It's looking like we're going to get another run at recreational marijuana, if they get enough signatures, and it'll probably happen. Yeah. As a lawman, where do you stand on legalizing cannabis and marijuana?
I've been in public opposition of this for many, many years.
Tell me why.
Okay, as a father of 2, I want to know that if there were a circumstance where either of our sons needed surgery, that the doctor who is working on them, and again, could they be high on their own? Sure, but that I don't have someone who's high on marijuana performing surgery on my loved one. I want to get on a plane and know that at least there are restrictions or rules in place that prohibit the person flying the plane from being impaired. And I recognize that opioids are legal when prescribed. Right. Marijuana is not. Opioids are more severe. Marijuana is not. Regardless, impairment in and of itself, if we become a society that feels as though that should be a okay common practice, you have to recognize the areas of jeopardy. Driving on the roadways, knowing that more people can consume marijuana lawfully, yet control a quarter-ton vehicle. I want to make sure my family's okay, and I want us to be thoughtful in our actions.
The reality is...
But let me say this real quick, and I apologize for interrupting. I do not believe that the laws and the government should be dictating everything for our behaviors. But when we are acting irresponsibly or misbehaving, then the government and the law has a responsibility to try to protect people from that.
Do you also share the belief that if you really want to get marijuana, you can get it now with a medical marijuana card? It's very easy. Now, granted, it's an impediment to somebody who just wants to get loaded on Friday night. They got to go get a card. They got to pay for it. Yeah. But if you really want it, you can get it.
Yeah, we have a bigger problem, John. We have a bigger problem. The problem is this. I still believe, the #1 consumer of illicit drugs in the world. And in the last few years, if you speak with DEA and tracking the numbers, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, and other counterfeit prescription drugs are on the increase for being imported into the country. The only one that's on the decrease is marijuana, and that's because now you can acquire it lawfully in a lot of states.
Let me ask you about, this is your MCSO posse. You revisited the posse, which is the volunteer people who help your department. Sheriff Joe made a big deal out of this, patrolling shopping malls, and he had the posse doing all kinds of stuff. You kind of revisited this. You temporarily suspended the force following an audit that revealed most of the members were not properly certified. Where do we stand on the posse right now?
Right, and so I want to be real respectful, because we have wonderful people who are volunteers that do a great service for this community.
You like
the
the
Sheriff's
posse
Office.
in general?
Absolutely. I look at the posse in some ways as an extension, like when I ran Silent Witness. The community is our greatest asset in fighting crime and for public support. So when you find those who are willing to sacrifice and volunteer their time to do it, it's an asset. But we have an obligation to make sure that there's a background process and a training process to properly equip them and to ensure that anyone representing this badge and this patch is deserving to do so. Doesn't make you a bad person if you don't meet our qualifications.
You wanted to tighten it up a little
Correct,
bit.
but
Is that fair to say?
I use this term often, but I am the gatekeeper of the reputation and the integrity of law enforcement in the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. So we need to have a standard, and I want even the volunteers, depending on the role and responsibility they carry, to meet that standard, so everyone in the community knows we're being thoughtful on their behalf.
Let me skip ahead to the Fountain Hills officer-involved shooting. It's going to take him a minute to get this video up, but basically back on January 7th, you had this incident with this man, Ismail Ahmed, called 911 making terrorist threats.
Back off.
He threw rocks at a deputy, approached with a knife at the Fountain Hills substation, and a deputy shot the 18-year-old after several warnings. And your take on this was interesting. Just let's revisit this for a second. Was it necessary to shoot this guy?
Unequivocally, the deputy's actions on that day were the highest level of professionalism from his tactics. He gave very clear demands. He was absolutely under duress. The suspect in that case had a knife as he advanced on him. The deputy did something that is uncommon, which is actually gave up ground, retreated as he continued to give commands until the point when he was in absolute immediate danger and fired on that individual. So in a time when we see a lot of videos of excessive force and poor judgment, in real life, in real time, when you don't have, it's not like Monday morning quarterbacking, it's in the moment. That deputy, in my opinion, did an exceptional job of not choosing deadly force, but having no other choice but to deliver deadly force to protect himself.
Cameras have been good.
Cameras are absolutely a benefit, more so than I thought they would.
I know you were kind of iffy on
no,
cameras.
I was.
Okay, we've got about 25 seconds left, Sheriff. What would you like to accomplish in a second term?
Continue on the path which we have been on, which is to ensure that the professionalization and the integrity of law enforcement is restored, because my #1 concern is that men and women out there stop choosing law enforcement as a profession because they lose faith in us or they don't see it as a redeeming profession. And the most important thing that I can do is restore that so that we are able to care for the next generation, because good men and women want to serve in this capacity.
It's hard to recruit, isn't it?
It's hard to recruit and to retain, but you know what? We're seeing the curve. We're seeing it turn right now. We're actually up by 60% in hiring this year versus the same time last year.
I appreciate it. Sheriff Paul Penzone on Newsmaker Saturday. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We're back in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday. Thank you, Sheriff. Thanks again for spending some time with us on Newsmaker Saturday. You can find me very easy, John Hook, Fox 10 on Facebook and Twitter. Look forward to seeing you next weekend on Newsmaker Saturday.